IPMNation.com.
This is Red Lawhern calling.
Hey, hello, sir. All right, at last we connect. Boy, what a relief. We were trying.
Sorry about that. It got a little tacky. I'm not quite sure what all happened here. We'll have to practice this a little bit before we try it again.
Yeah.
At any rate.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I'll just share quickly with the listeners. We were actually trying before the show. We were going to try to bring you on the Facebook calling. But that wasn't working out, so we're doing this the traditional way. But finally, we connect, so it's all good. I'll probably edit some of that out of the podcast version. But no, this is great because I'm very excited to talk to you. And we've got a lot of people online who are listening as well, who are anxious to hear our discussion. I see Fred Bonig from the dailyripple.org is in there as well. So, Doctor, and is it Lawhern? Is that how you say your last name?
Lots of people pronounce it various ways. That one will do.
Lawhern, okay. All right, wonderful. Well, tell us, just kind of give us a quick synopsis of who you are, and then we'll get into our discussion.
Sure, absolutely. This is something I make a habit of doing in any case because I want people to understand that there are limits to what I know and what I'm professionally qualified to advise people on. That's done under the principle of first do no harm. I am an advocate for people in pain. I have been doing work in advocacy and in the analysis of medical literature for pain patients for over 20 years. I got into this business because my spouse came down with an extremely painful disorder that's fairly rare, involving neuropathic pain in her face.
Okay.
And I broadened my view from my involvement in the field to touch a number of other pain communities in social media. I have been very active in Facebook and Twitter. My qualifications, however, are in information recovery and analysis as a system engineer and information miner. Did a lot of that in the military for 2 different careers, either in the military or supporting military as a contractor. And so I come into the engagement with people in pain and their caregivers and their families from a perspective of being a caregiver myself and likewise having had some serious training in recovering stuff, if you will, recovering and understanding the vocabulary that is used by medical professionals. I've done technology evaluation in medical devices, and so I'm coming to this essentially as somebody who doesn't have a particular pony in this race from any professional perspective, and that gives me the option of simply trying to find and communicate and share with people truth and an understanding of what is going on in the world that affects them as medical patients and as people who are dealing with very often very significant life-altering issues.
Mm-hmm.
Of late, I've been very active in challenging, and people who know me from social media are aware of this, but I've been very active in challenging the errors and distortions and biases that have been built into the 2016 opioid prescription guidelines that were published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Okay.
And I have a lot of published work in that area. I do have published work that you can find by searching on my name in over 60 published articles and papers, some of them in legitimate professional journals and co-authored with MDs, others of them in popular journals like the Crime Report and National Pain Report or the National Pain News. So, I come to this as someone who's trying to help patients and their doctors to speak sensibly on issues of public policy that I regard to be extremely distorted and in need of correction. Has that been adequate for you?
Absolutely. And, of course, the reason... Well, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why this is relevant, but one of the big ones is, we have, the opioid crisis, and here in Manchester, New Hampshire, where I am, Actually, I forgot to ask you, by the way, where are you calling from? Because you're not local to this area.
No, I'm physically located just south of the North Carolina line in Fort Mill, South Carolina.
Gotcha. Okay. So here in Manchester, and of course all over the country, but it's especially severe here. We have the heroin crisis, and one of the things that happens, obviously, when we have these issues, the heroin crisis, the opioid crisis, and of course there may or may not be connected depending on how you look at it, but in terms of cause and effect and whatnot, but people always look for, or specifically politicians, or as I like to refer to them, our elected lawgivers and overlords, look for reasons for what causes this. Ultimately, it's not so important to them, in my view, that they necessarily figure out what the true causes are, as it is important for them to look like they're doing something about it. So in the course of trying to look like they're doing something about it, very often, what is presented by them as the causes, and then their solutions are not always adequate or what we need. I am someone who, in the macro, I oppose the drug war, and I tend to be very skeptical that our elected lawgivers and overlords really know how to deal with any of this stuff. Whether it's heroin, whether it's other illegal drugs or drugs that should not be illegal, or whether it's opioids. And I know that one of the things that you have challenged is this notion that politicians have put forth that, oh, it's the doctors. The doctors are over-prescribing. That's who we need to blame. We need to blame the doctors. And then if we blame the doctors, well, again, because they have to look like they're doing something. So the next logical step for them is we need legislation. And we've seen that here in New Hampshire. We need legislation which limits what doctors can do. And I have seen up close, and I'm sure you have too, and I'm sure many others have, instances where those very policies are, A, very often misunderstood by the medical profession because they're overcomplicated, and B, they end up doing like so much of what the government does when they try to fix this stuff or try to look like they're fixing it. It actually makes the problem worse, not better, and there's unintended consequences and so forth. So so that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested to talk to you today, is because I know that you're out there. And I wish there were more voices like yours challenging this notion that we have to, blame it on the doctors. They're overprescribing. Meanwhile, there's people who genuinely need these prescriptions that aren't getting what they need because doctors are walking around on eggshells, afraid to prescribe what may be medically necessary in some cases to relieve pain. So if you can kind of talk about that, Doctor, I'd love to hear more about that.
Matt. Sure, Matt. And you're kind of setting up an outline for quite a long speech if you're not careful. So interrupt me if you find a place where you want to get amplification, or really make clarity for your listeners.
Sure.
Basically, the problem we've got, as far as there being an opioid crisis, is a real problem in public health. But it's not a problem that was ever caused by overprescribing. And it's taken a very long time for that reality to penetrate the consciousness of any of our legislators, because they have a tendency to look for the simple solution. Mm-hmm. And even their staffers, many times, are very junior people who do not have a lot of experience with medical issues, even those who are doing medical policy writing for legislators. And they're taken in by various points of view or opinions that are represented as fact that are, in fact, not facts at all. So let's start back a little bit on this. The origins of a lot of the argument that's going on in public policy was the easing of restrictions on opioids in the period between 2000 and 2010 under a policy that was called pain as the fifth vital sign. And that policy, or doctrine, if you will, held that pain was vastly undertreated, and I might add it still is, but that it could be treated safely and without serious consideration or concern for negative side effects if doctors would prescribe opioids in large quantities until they found a level of dosage that would help the patient deal with the pain. And there's a lot of truth in that, but there's also a lot of fraud in that. The big pharmaceutical companies did underrepresent or even hide the risks to some patients, and it's not a huge number, but it is certainly some. They hid them with what amounted to a vast campaign of false advertising and of trying to influence thought leaders. That's a phrase you see in the industry a lot.
Yes.
And a couple of big pharmaceutical companies had to settle billion-dollar level lawsuits with various governments because they did materially misrepresent the problem. However, and this is the big leap that legislators have an awful time realizing, even if you allow for the misbehavior of the big pharmaceutical companies, and that was real, it was confirmed in court, if you look at the numbers, as I have as a non-physician data analyst, if you look at the numbers and you say, well, is there a relationship between the rates of prescribing by doctors for their patients and the rates of overdose-related death? If you ask that question, and you go in and you look at the data and you plot it all nicely, neatly on axes, and you make the comparison for the 50 U.S. states plus D.C., and there's a wide variation in rates of prescribing in the sense of how many prescriptions get written per 100 population. Mm-hmm. There's a huge variation. It's like 4 to 1 across the collection of 50 states. And then you say, okay, what are the rates of death across that range? The rates of death from all sources, whether they are opioids that are prescribed or diverted, because there is a diversion problem, or street opioids. And what you find out is that when you plot these two, if the two were actually related, what you would expect to see is a bunch of dots on a rising line, fairly closely clumped around a line of some kind. It might be a straight line or it might be a curve. And the more prescribing that happens, the higher the rate of death ought to be.
Right.
Because that's the medical prescription vector model, if you will. But when you actually do the analysis, you don't see that. What you see is the kind of pattern you get by pointing a shotgun at the barn door and letting fly.
Okay. So in other words, so there's no evidence there. In other words, so
in fact, the evidence is in exactly the opposite direction.
Okay.
Even allowing for the contribution that diverted prescriptions might make, the contribution of medically managed prescription opioids to mortality is so small that it doesn't move the meter.
Okay.
And as a result, any kind of public policy that says we're going to solve our opioid crisis by restricting the availability of prescriptions is not only flat wrong, it's fraud. Mm-hmm. It is deliberate misrepresentation of reality in order to pursue the appearance of doing something.
Right, exactly. That's right. That's what I was saying before, because they have to look like they're doing something. Yep.
Yeah, well, the CDC really got put in the position of being told by their director exactly that back in 2015.
Really?
And their director was a fellow by the name of Tom Friedman at the time, and he had a very cozy relationship with an organization called Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing. And that cozy relationship extended to deciding to take on a mission that the CDC had never done before for much of anything else, to write a guideline that would restrict opioids medical opioids, in the hope that they would be able to reduce overdose rates and addiction rates. And the process that unfolded from there was one where an awful lot of bias got involved, an awful lot of people from the Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing actually contributed in one way or another to the consultants group that CDC had to hire because they didn't have anybody in-house to do the work. And when it's all sorted out and they actually eventually published, they were actually challenged by a subcommittee of Congress in the House Oversight Committee on the basis of their having done a lot of their work in secret without public review or input. And they were forced to open up their draft document for comment. They got over 4,000 comments, many of them from professional organizations that opposed what they were doing, and they just flat ignored it and went right ahead anyway and did what they were told by their director that they had to do. And by the way, this is not just an opinion on my part. It's something where there is a published record from multiple authors, which we can, if you ever get to a point where you want to put something up on your website, I can give you a list of references here that's about as long as your arm.
Oh, sure.
So,
Red, not to interrupt, but Anita C. Spiro is asking a question in the Facebook live chat that relates to the CDC guidelines you're talking about. She's saying, I'm a non-treated sufferer. I would like Red to explain better what is going on with the AMA. The AMA has come out in opposition to the CDC guidelines. Can he explain better what that means now and for the future? So the AMA, of course, the American Medical Association, for anyone who doesn't know.
Sure, and this is really, really current news in this, and it's a major breakthrough. About 2 weeks ago, the AMA had a meeting of what they call their House of Delegates. It's what they do every year. I think they might even do it more than once, but they do it every year. And they had 3 resolutions tabled for the House of Delegates to consider and vote on, and they did. And when you sum those resolutions up, I don't want to read them because they're fairly lengthy, but when you sum them up, what they basically say is the CDC got it wrong. And they got it wrong by publishing a guideline that proposes that there's sort of a one-size-fits-all answer to overprescribing. And the one-size-fits-all that they came up with, that the CDC came up with, was a recommendation for a safety review for any patient that is prescribed above the level of approximately 90 morphine milligram equivalent daily dose, which I might add is really quite a modest prescription level. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. that are being maintained on much higher doses than that. There's over 1.6 million just in the Medicare system, not to mention private insurance. So they basically said, we think there's evidence that when prescribing is higher than that level for anybody, that you really ought to be concerned about safety, and you ought to do a review of the benefits versus the risks to the patient of going higher than that. Well, there's all sorts of things that are wrong with that, but the big one was that even though CDC phrased their document as voluntary and directed primarily to general practitioners rather than pain medicine specialists, a lot of doctors and a lot of hospitals and a lot of state legislators took that 90 number and said, oh, finally, we got an easy answer.
Yep.
Anybody that's prescribing more than that is prescribing too much. That is the leap that legislators all over the country made. It's the leap that hospitals made because they said, well, CDC says 90 mmED is dangerous. We better not prescribe more than that because if we do, they'll sue us or somebody will sue us.
Right.
And the DEA got into the act and they said, well, gosh, oh, gee, the CDC says overprescribing is a problem, so we better make sure doctors can't do it without being hauled in and investigated.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody got on the bandwagon.
Right.
And everybody had it wrong. And finally, the AMA, after about 2.5 years of dithering, has come out, and pardon me, I don't mean to be nasty about this, but I think AMA was really kind of late to the party on this.
You're on the right show to be nasty.
They came out with 3 resolutions that basically say it is improper and incorrect to take disciplinary action or even to investigate any physician who prescribes above 90 morphine milligram equivalents per day in a good faith effort to help their patients. The physician and the patient knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
The DEA doesn't, and by the way, DEA is not mentioned explicitly in their resolutions. I don't want to be unfair to the AMA folks either.
Yeah.
But when you take these and you say to yourself, well, gosh, the organization that represents about a quarter of all doctors in America have said to the DEA, your guidelines are being grossly inappropriately used by legislators to restrict both the length of prescriptions that are available to people who are first prescribed and the strength that is available on the basis of the judgment of a doctor. And that is a sea change when you say AMA is highly authoritative. They don't do things like this just because they want to appear to be doing something.
Right.
And when they come out so directly opposing government policy, somebody better sit up and take notice, because what they've said, as I've just said, is the federal government and many state governments have got the story wrong. Now, we can add to that something that is really also, it's been out there a while, but a lot of people have never noticed it. And this isn't AMA. This is an organization called the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, NIDA. They are headed by a doctor by the name of Nora Volkow. And Nora Volkow and a co-author of hers, a PhD by the last name of McClellan, did an article, again, in the Journal of the AMA, I believe, in which she basically says, we now know, and I'm paraphrasing now, this is not direct quote, we now know that the occurrence of opioid abuse or addiction in patients who are prescribed opioids medically is not a predictable outcome. Mm-hmm. It is rare. In fact, figures that are quoted, and I believe she does quote these in her articles, seem to indicate that something on the order of 1% to 2% of all patients who are prescribed an opioid to control pain may have a problem with abuse at a later time. The other thing that the article does that is really important is that it says addiction is not the same thing as dependence. It's also not the same thing as tolerance.
Interesting.
And a lot of people have gotten these three things confused. They're not the same thing. They don't have the same brain chemistry. And you don't treat them all by reducing the amount of opioids that are available. That's just not proper policy.
Red, I got to just to interject for a second, because we've got a lot of activity in the chat room I want to address. Plus, Jon Hopwood is here. I think he has a question. But let me just ask you quickly too, because I want to get clarity on something. So when the CDC makes a rule like they did, or a guideline, as you put it, am I correct that is not legally binding until all these state legislatures, like you were talking about, until they actually act on it or something is done federally? Or
yes, as a matter of fact, you're quite correct.
Okay.
The horrifying part of this is that CDC used an easy dodge that they should have known better. They used a dodge by saying, well, this is a voluntary guideline. We think it's important to do the safety review. And they should have known that everybody else would jump on this and make it mandatory. And that's exactly what happened.
Okay. Anita also is asking, can doctors who have lost their license use these new resolves to try to get their license back? That must be a tough hill to climb, I would think, for a doctor.
Now, Matt, remember, you're asking a question that is a legal type question.
Yeah.
I believe, and this is a phrase I'm using very, very carefully, I believe that a smart lawyer should be able to get a doctor's license back by simply pointing out that over-prescribing in a lot of these cases where there's been no evidence of harm to patients, and that's not all the cases now, but when there's been no evidence of a harm to a patient, a smart lawyer ought to be able to go back into court and sue on grounds of essentially incorrect input by the DEA and or state authorities. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be easy.
Right.
Because these authorities are very much defending their own turf.
Exactly.
They don't want to be called and shown to have done the wrong thing, and they're going to fight it. They're going to fight
Absolutely.
it with any means, fair or foul, and that includes dragging their feet and dragging out cases in court until they die from lack of stamina.
Right.
These outfits use a doctrine that's called the doctrine of sovereign immunity, and also use other, neat dodges. But the big one that's really nasty is that the DEA will prominently announce that the doctor that they've targeted is being investigated, and then they will go to the doctor's employees and they will say, oh, you better testify that they did something wrong, because if you don't, we'll go after you too.
Right.
Now, by any other label, what that is what that should be called is suborning witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
It's a technique that's used by hungry prosecutors who want to look like they're doing something and who don't care that what they're basically doing is persecuting a doctor, not prosecuting them.
Yes. There's
and we've seen that. We've seen that often enough to be a fairly big pattern. So to answer the question, to draw it back as you posed it, interestingly enough, we had a program on just a couple of weeks ago with George Knapp. He runs an investigative program with Las Vegas Now, and he runs a number of programs on coast-to-coast AM radio. They have an audience of 8 million people.
Oh, yeah.
And he had on an investigator by the name of Josh Bloom, who is with the American Council for Science and Health, just a couple of weeks ago. And basically, they had a dial-in lawyer who came in and said that lawyer, and I don't have his name, I wish the heck I did, and I hope George releases it. They had a lawyer call in who basically said, I have successfully prosecuted cases and gotten acquittals on the grounds that the DEA and state authorities have no objective criteria for deciding when a doctor is overprescribing. The only criteria, and the lawyer didn't say this, the only criteria that is probably really tough to get a jury to buy into is if one or more patients of the doctors have died under his care or her care, then you got a different situation. But if the DEA was successful in forcing the doctor into a consent decree or in prosecuting a case against a doctor in which their license is pulled by a state authority because they're accused of overprescribing, then there's beginning to be evidence that just maybe, with the right kind of legal defense, there is grounds for going back in and appealing these convictions.
Okay. I want to come back to the Facebook live chat in a second, but Jon Hopwood is here, and I think he has a question or a comment.
Well, there's so much to comment about, but one thing, I don't have it with me, but I have a National Institute of Health report from 2015 before this latest outburst in the drug war on drugs.
Yes.
As saying that people, and you've made the distinction between medical use and non-medical use, that, the medical use and where it's supervised. And both my father and my stepmother had cancer, and which brings you part of a community where you talk about treating pain. And I have chronic pain. I'm up at the VA with the veterans, and many of whom have chronic pain. But it comes to the conclusion that most people do not get addicted to OxyContin and these other prescription opiates.
Right.
It's not like my father was going out to get street drugs or anything.
Right, exactly.
And when you read some of the statistics, they say, like, there's 21 million people in the United States that are addicted to opiates or whatever. What would that be? Less than 1%. But, this is just one thing. There seems to be people that just get addicted. And then we can go back maybe later, because the DSM-5, which is used, that's the Manual of Psychology, and which has been heavily criticized and rejected on many levels by many people, started making a distinction between addiction, which gives you a legal status in a court where you can be diverted into a drug court in a different program, or substance abuse, which is a lifestyle choice.
Well, it's like Red was saying, too. There's a difference between addiction, dependency, and what was the other one? Tolerance?
Tolerance, right.
Yeah.
Could I respond to part of this? And
please do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
In the interest of time.
Right.
You were mentioning an NIH report. There's kind of an interesting problem here, and because a lot of the stuff that NIH uses is in one way or another derived from statistics that CDC compiles. CDC got caught with their fingers in the till just recently because they were reporting deaths due to illegal fentanyl as deaths related to prescription drugs. And in that reporting, in effect, what they did was lump together things that are very different so that they could inflate the figures that seem to be relating opioid overdose deaths to medical opioids. And, you can argue until you're blue in the face on whether that was an accident or not. But, in fact, by misreporting misreporting illegal street opioids like fentanyl, which is really dangerous, as simply synthetic opioids. For that matter, heroin is a synthetic opioid when you get right down to it.
Yes.
And by reporting them that way and using that vocabulary, they created the impression that deaths due to opioids and prescription opioids were much higher than they really are.
Right.
So let me give you a set of figures, and we'll do this quick-like, and I'll try to make it as clear as I can. The figure is sometimes used that overdose-related deaths topped 75,000. Well, there's a little oops in that. 42,000 of those deaths in one way or another were related to opioids of any kind. The great majority of them, of those 42,000, let us say something around 22,000, maybe 24, it's in that range, were deaths due to synthetic opioids like fentanyl. And when you boil the figures down, what you find out is that the dominant sources of mortality, in order, are fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, and methadone that's been diverted.
Okay.
Prescription opioids are involved as the fifth factor down in the heap. But when you even examine the opioid deaths in certain states where a prescription opioid has been found, what you find out is that the prescription opioid is almost never alone.
Yeah.
It's accompanied by illegal opioids and alcohol, or it may be accompanied by one of the anti-anxiety drugs in the benzodiazepine class. So when you boil that 76,000 figure down, it might mean that maybe 2,000 people accidentally overdosed or suicided, because you don't know, on just a prescription drug.
Yeah, because
the figures don't hold up if you look at them at all closely.
Right, if you look at them rationally, because like my father and my stepmother, they were giving drugs, certain drugs, they're opiates, of course, but they're not just grabbing a hold of anything like out on the street, this, that, the other thing.
Right.
And there was such a friend of mine was an oncologist because her father had died of cancer, and there was this huge battle about the, end of life cancer patients were being undertreated for pain. There was speculation.
And that's true.
One of the thing, and there was also a thing, this was in the 90s, and I was in California, that heroin would be effective with pain, but it would shorten their life. And then there was the cynical idea that a hospital wants to, it always advertises itself, you get we extend your life. And we're talking about like a couple of months or something.
Yeah.
But agonizing pain of these people. And finally, they decided to treat people. Because chronic pain is awful. Sometimes, when my back, I'm disabled. I need...
Of course, yeah, of course. Robert Denby in the Facebook live chat is commenting that he's enjoying the show and learning a lot. Go ahead, Doctor, and then I have another question from Anita and a couple other things.
Respond to that.
Yeah.
I have talked with, I should say I've communicated with in social media. In the last 20 years, I have talked with over 30,000 people in pain. Yeah. That's more people than most doctors ever see in a full career.
Wow.
So I get a real cross-section here. But what I am hearing all across America is that doctors are leaving pain management practice. Even those who remain in pain management practice are telling their patients, I can't prescribe for you because it will put my license at risk.
Yeah.
We're hearing stories from pain patients who are literally in agony.
Yeah.
And they can't find a doctor in an entire state that will prescribe for them.
Right. Yeah.
So that one is widespread. It's not just a few people. I believe that I've seen evidence in social media of, at the very least, hundreds of patient suicides.
Oh, no doubt.
And I'm talking hundreds. I am willing to back that figure, even though there is no really good NIH data on it.
Yeah.
And the suicides are happening especially among veterans. And here's a little wrinkle. This is what I think that Matt will appreciate. Last spring, there was a paper that was scheduled for to a major conference on opioids that the VA convened. A few days before that paper was to be presented, the VA came back to the authors and told them, I'm sorry, but this paper needs to be vetted and validated before we can see it published in a VA venue. They took the paper back. I have heard, and I cannot confirm this from anything published, so be careful with this. I have heard that paper has been vetted no less than 4 times since last spring, and the VA is still sitting on it.
Of course it is.
Right, right.
Can I just comment on that, and then you can go, because, I have some with the VA. About politics, we've actually had somebody on here that was running for Congress that said he's going to put doctors in jail because they're responsible for the opioid epidemic, which he was a rather good guy, but that was kind of shocking. In our state, which our president has called, like a drug-infested den and stuff. At the time, Maggie Hassan was the governor. She's now a U.S. senator. And Chris Sununu, who is now the governor, was going to run against her. And the former mayor here was going to run, too. And he was the mayor of Manchester, which is like kind of the epicenter of drugs here. So much so that Cops, the TV show, was going to do a whole year here about what was going on. But so all of a sudden, Maggie Hassan gets hit on, you've done nothing to stop the drugs. Mm-hmm. And then Chris Sununu starts hitting our mayor, and, he's not one of my favorite person, but unfairly, that he's responsible for it. So that becomes an issue. And then suddenly Maggie Hassan's going to run for Senate. Then a U.S. Senator, Kelly Ayotte, jumps in. Suddenly, there are no opiates at the VA Medical Center in Manchester, New Hampshire. Yeah. So they took us off cold turkey. These are guys from Vietnam, guys coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with traumatic brain injuries, that have been wounded in tremendous pain. And all of a sudden, they just cut you off with nothing because of politics. And I was told, I've been in 9 and 10 pain. When you're in 9 and 10 pain, and, take 800 milligrams of, ibuprofen or something. It doesn't work. And you actually feel like you want to be dead at that point. You're moving across the floor if you can, like a crab. I was told if that happens again, go to Massachusetts.
You're repeating a narrative I've heard over and over and over again.
I was told, go to Massachusetts and they will give it to you.
And you're describing a reality that applies to hundreds of thousands of patients. Literally, hundreds of thousands of people are facing the very same issues you've just described.
One last thing. The politicians would scapegoat veterans. They're going out and selling. I've actually heard this, drugs.
Oh, sure.
It was disgusting, and I have PTSD, so I'm going to go out, take a little walk now.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Jon Hopwood is leaving us, but that's true. They scapegoat veterans, they scapegoat doctors, they scapegoat whomever. We have some folks in the chat who are getting a little impatient. The natives are restless. Chuck Gosson is in there. Hello, Chuck. Robert Denby. Peter, I'll get to your comment, I promise. Anita has another question. This relates to what she had asked earlier, but she said, with the AMA/CDC guideline issue, what does this mean for the future? Is it possible to change other areas of the guidelines and issues, like abandonment by doctors? Can this really stop doctors from losing their licenses and harassment as a sufferer? Is there a reason to feel any relief that the future may be better for us? So she's looking for some hope.
There's that we got to realize what the process is likely to look like.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen overnight. A lot of people who have messed this up are really not going to want to get caught with their fingers on the till,
right,
or on the balance beams. A lot of people in government are basically going to claim ignorance. A lot of other people are going to claim, well, we did it with the best of intentions. And what you're going to get is a lot of confusion for at least several months, possibly more than 1 year. But what I'm seeing is that the doors are opening. And the real challenge we're going to have here, a real challenge, is considering how much the DEA has been involved in essentially criminal activity. They're not going to stop, not instantly. They're going to go on prosecuting doctors. And as long as they're allowed to do this crap, which it is, we're going to have what's called a hostile regulatory environment where everybody's going to be afraid to be the first one.
Right. Absolutely.
So we're going to wind up having to do something that is really hard and uphill and necessary and possible. You can hear the combination of things there. We're going to have pain patients who are willing to look up the number of their local legislator, the person who represents them in Congress or their senators, and call that office and tell the office people, you guys need to weigh in right now because I'm dying because of your negligence.
Right. Yeah.
I'm dying because you haven't retracted legislation or retracted the authority of the DEA that is forcing my doctor out of practice and forcing him to desert me. I want your commitment and your legislators' commitment right freaking now.
Right. Yeah. No. Well said. Peter Galinas in the Facebook live chat says, no, and again, this relates to the, doctors losing licenses and stuff. He said, no victim, no crime. Again, referring to, if a doctor hasn't lost anyone under their care or no one's been hurt under their care, how is it that they've harmed someone? He says, the doctor can get license back. Also, I believe the correct term is witness coercion. Again, kind of piggybacking on what you were saying earlier. Hello to Jon Hopwood, who joins us in the Facebook live chat. And Fred Bonig says, one of the issues in West Virginia is the pharmaceutical rep got a bonus for sales. Oh, interesting. This brings up something interesting. The pharmacy filled the prescriptions without question, even when there were more prescriptions than residents in the town, making him millions in bonuses. Drug firms shipped 20 milligram pain. I'm sorry, 20.8 milligram pain pills to a West Virginia town with 2,500 people. I'm sorry, 2,900 people.
Let me try that with you because I've been through that process too.
Okay.
There was a series on CBS 60 Minutes. It was also published in a different form by a different author in the Washington Post, which looked at the failure of the DEA to aggressively prosecute a company called McKesson, because McKesson is a billion-dollar scale drug distribution company. They take meds from the manufacturer and they deliver them to the pharmacies that dispense them. And they keep records.
Yeah.
They keep records that are really quite detailed, and they have to under the law because anything that's on a controlled substance list is tracked all the way through. And basically, investigators of the DEA were noting the very same thing you've just related to. And it's not only in West Virginia. We also see it in rural states out west and in the Deep South, and particularly in Florida. So there's a lot of places where an awful lot of volume is being shipped to places by McKesson and by other major drug distributors, where if you did the numbers, even in a spreadsheet, and did a comparison between county populations or zip code populations and the volume of deliveries made, you would get in flashing red lights an alarm bell. And the big companies who did all of this shipping never did the exercise, or if they did it, they just ignored it.
Mm-hmm.
And when it came down to it, the agents in the DEA who tried to blow the whistle on this, they were told by their own prosecutors Oh, no. We're not going to go after these guys really, really seriously. They are the name of this game, and they are deep pockets, and they will keep us tied up forever if we try to seriously go after them. So we'll give them a minor fine. I think the minor fine was $27 million to a company that grosses over $1 billion a year.
Drop in the bucket for them. Yep. Cost of doing business.
So, and it's big business. It certainly is. But the bottom line is, the data are already available in the system if somebody will simply break them out and put them together.
Yeah.
So we indeed have, and here's the missing piece. This now is not a reality; it is an inference. So be very careful. This you can take as my opinion.
Okay.
It's not necessarily a fact, and I don't represent it as a fact. The appearance of all this is that McKesson and other major companies that were shipping these huge volumes, when they were told by figures in the government, there could be a problem with this, they basically said to the prosecutors, well, guys, people who really understand our business do make a whole lot more money when they come to work for us as lobbyists than they ever did in government. Hint, hint, hint. And the people who should have been with their hands on the switch basically said, oh, yeah, as a matter of fact, I could make a whole lot more money at this as a lobbyist. Maybe I better go do that.
Yep.
And if we didn't have a revolving door on this sort of thing, which we still do, and if congressmen who basically receive a humongous amount of donations, so-called, also known as bribes, from major companies like McKesson and others, if they hadn't been bought, we wouldn't be in this boat with them.
Right. Well, that's what I always say. Follow the money, and you can apply that to just about anything. And I always say too, our elected lawgivers and overlords, they don't actually work for us. They work for whoever's paying the bills, and the corporate donors and the lobbyists, and the pharmaceutical lobby. I mean, they certainly own our Congress, and that's I mean, among other lobbies.
The only way that changes is with people involving themselves again in a process where their vote should count, their voice should count, and they should be voicing in large numbers, and I'm talking tens of thousands in each congressional phone number. Mm-hmm. They should be voicing to their congressman, you're not going to get away with this. If you vote against the interests of people in pain, your tail is grail, Bubba.
Yeah.
We're going to vote you out of office, and we're going to do it very publicly, and the tide is turning, and media is beginning to recognize that there's something really wrong with what you've been doing. Right. So wake up and smell the coffee. If you want to be a public servant, then be a public servant. Stop taking contributions from people who have a vested interest in what you do.
We have a
vested financial interest.
Oh, exactly. We have a question in the Facebook live chat from Kenneth Ratliff. He's asking, Doctor, what % of the patients prescribed pain pills are just drug-seeking or selling the pills themselves? Good question. I don't know if we have. Do we have a number?
Reselling it, and that percentage is a really tough one to get.
Yeah. Because
the people who are doing this kind of activity really aren't going to advertise. But let me put it this way: there are some very good indications in terms of do patients actually go back and get repeated prescriptions for something that's unreal. And here's a good study that was published. I believe it was the British Medical Journal, but it could have been the Journal of the AMA. A really serious study was done on patients who are given opioids as a result of pain after surgery.
Okay.
There was over 650,000 patients that were followed for an average of 2.5 years between 2008 and 2016. They followed the records, and they looked for protracted prescribing that was renewed over and over and over for at least 13 weeks and more.
Okay.
And in 11 common surgical procedures, The 4 of the 11 showed no increase in chronic prescribing at all.
Really? Okay.
And among the other 7, the number of people who got prescriptions over and over again varied from 0.6 to 1.7%.
That's very low.
And then when you look at the reasons for that, it turns out that they got chronic prescribing for surgeries that are well known to have a high incidence of long-term complications.
That makes sense.
Things like total hip replacement.
Mm-hmm.
People who went through a cesarean section, for instance, women who went through a cesarean section, had the same rate of chronic prescribing after surgery as they did before.
Okay.
Now, I had another study, also very high numbers, 650,000 people in this study, and it's different people, so you can add them.
Yeah.
Investigators went looking for diagnoses of opioid abuse disorder, which is the term that was used in the DSM-4 rather than the DSM-5. And they looked for periods, again, about 2.5 years, and what they discovered was that the risk of an opioid use disorder diagnosis was a maximum of 0.6% in 650,000 patients who had been given an opioid for the control of pain following surgery. The inference we can draw from that is that people who renew their prescriptions over and over and over again in order to get pain pills to sell are a tiny minority. They're an absolutely tiny minority. And by the way, there is absolutely no evidence, at least that I've ever seen, that prescription drug monitoring programs that are now in effect in 49 out of 50 states have resulted in any decrease in opioid mortality in any of those states. There is just no evidence for that. And one of the people who writes on it most that I want to plug just a little bit is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. His name is Jeffrey Singer. He's an MD. He works out of one of the western states. I think it's Arizona. And he's done an awful lot of articles on exactly this subject because what he's saying is, guys, the war on drugs is a miserable failure.
Yes.
And it isn't helping anybody.
Right.
And he's saying it with a lot of data and science behind him, and he's not alone.
Well, the problem is the war on drugs does help those who profit from it, and unfortunately, there's a lot of people who profit from it. Anita in the Facebook live chat says, on opiates, I started a business and could drive, eat, and sleep. This is all gone now. It's sad. I used to be a bodybuilder. Now I have not left my house since September. Wow. By the way, so when we talk about, I hear this term diversion. When we talk about diversion, is that what you're referring to when you talk about, someone who maybe sells their pills or gives them to someone? I mean, is that what we mean, or is diversion something different?
It's partly what we mean. But,
okay.
Diversion basically means that somebody other than the person that a prescription was made to is either given or steals the drug or buys it from a street dealer who got it from somebody who stole it.
Okay.
In this case, what we're really saying is that there's a problem, and this one is probably a pretty real problem. I want to be pretty balanced about this. There is a problem with people taking medications that are left over, that are left in a home medicine closet.
Yeah.
Because they're not turned in. They're put in a place where kids can get at them, and kids are notorious for experimenting with these things.
Yeah.
Now, the statistic that's quoted, and it's a wrong statistic if you don't qualify it. There was a study done by survey with people who are using heroin, and they asked, what was the first drug you ever used? And something on the order of 70% of them basically said, well, I used a prescription drug that I was given or that I stole from the home medicine closet. So that figure is quoted often, but the one that isn't quoted is that of those who first use a prescription drug as an experimental drug of some sort or a non-medical use, about 90% of them never had a prescription from anybody and were never seen by a doctor. This is not a problem with doctors overprescribing. It's a problem with drugs meant for pain patients being diverted by theft or by being given to somebody who is so underinsured that they can't see a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of this is, it's my belief, and this is a really, really tough one to prove because you have to do it by survey, and people are notoriously dishonest when they're surveyed on this subject.
Sure.
My belief is that the great majority of pill mills don't have anything to do with volumes of drugs that are stolen this way. Those pill mills are being supplied by major suppliers who should know better. If they just track the numbers and realize this is disproportionate, it's wrong. The bulk of diversion is happening by corporations, not by individuals.
Interesting. Okay. By the way, Jenny in the Facebook live chat says sometimes there is an issue of vets being stolen from veterans. Found out that happened in my son's high school. A doctor told me the same thing. It's not from high rates of diversion. It's stealing out of cabinets of veterans. She also said, very true in New Hampshire, we passed monitoring. We passed laws limiting meds, and our overdose deaths have gone up, not down. Only Safe Station has brought any reduction at all.
That's not just in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
It's all across the country. The fact is that since the peak of prescribing in 2010 to 2011, rates of prescribing for opioids for pain have dropped by something like 40%. Deaths from all sources of opioid overdose have tripled in the same period. So what we've got is a very clear indicator that prescribing is not the problem, and it never was.
Right. Yeah. Oh, Jenny clarified. She meant vets as in animal doctors, not veterans.
Animal doctors type prescriptions do occasionally get diverted. The volume of that is really not very large.
Yeah.
There's a lot of propaganda being put out, and there are a lot of very poignant stories about pain meds being prescribed for animals and then being stolen. I think it probably happens, but the numbers are so tiny that it doesn't make a difference.
Fred in the Facebook live chat says, you can't make oxycodone at home like meth, so every pill was made legally, made profit for the pharmaceutical company, whether it was sold legally or not, every pill. So why would pharmaceutical companies want to stop the problem? It goes against their profit margins. Well, yeah, exactly. Of course. It's all about the money, always.
You can see that as a possibility, but there is a kind of an interesting figure that we ought to recognize here. In 2000, I think it was 2010, OxyContin, the formulation of OxyContin was changed by FDA fiat, or direction, to make OxyContin harder to abuse, harder to crush. And it became supposedly abuse resistant. Resistant is the figure here. It doesn't mean it can't be. It just means it is harder.
Okay.
When that happened in the 4 years following the reformulation of OxyContin, the prescription rate for OxyContin went down by 2/3, and the number of deaths due to opioids of all kinds tripled. So, what you've got here is an indicator of two things. For one thing, people with addiction, and I want to be careful. I don't want to stigmatize people with addiction because there's a problem here.
Yeah.
But there's a problem that we've got to have some compassion for.
Yes.
People who already have addiction, who may have been using OxyContin that they had diverted or had gotten from a relative, they didn't die from something that they got out of a medicine closet cabinet. They died very frequently from something where somebody took heroin and cut it with fentanyl and put it into a pill stamp that you could buy on the freaking internet and sold as if it was OxyContin. This is the fentanyl, again, a new dimension of the fentanyl crisis. Fentanyl is killing more people than heroin and prescription drugs combined because it's being used as a cheap way of getting people high in a very uncontrolled and unregulated street market. Mm-hmm. And there's also an indicator here. This one is horrible. Right now, the CDC has recently, this fall, published figures on the connections between people who have chronic pain and have been treated for it versus people who suicide for all reasons. They estimate that about 8.5% of all suicides occur among people who have been treated for chronic pain. The step they don't take that they should take is if they really looked at this and looked at the patient records of people who are in that situation, what they would discover is that large numbers of those people had been cut off by their doctors. They suicided after their pain was so undertreated that they could not stand it anymore.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And there's evidence for that. It is not conclusive, and I don't want to represent it as conclusive, but we have the indications that people who are being deserted by their doctors are being driven into the street where they encounter adulterated drugs and get into trouble with drugs that they don't know what the hell they're taking. And as a result, they are very vulnerable, taking something that's supposed to help them that isn't what they thought it was.
Right, right. Absolutely. You know, until relatively recently, we had an attorney general in the United States who was on record saying, you know, he because he fought against, he's very anti-cannabis to the point of even opposing medical cannabis. And he said, you know, if you have somebody asked him, you know, what if someone has cancer and they're suffering? He said, take an aspirin. You know, I mean, it's incredible. You know, just the and I want to. That kind of leads me. And Anita, I do see your comment. We'll get to that, I promise. But I want to ask you. I mean, do you think that are you encouraged by the increased use of access to medical cannabis and cannabis in general in this country? And because it seems like that is a pretty effective way to, you know, a lot of people instead of using pharmaceuticals, those who are able to switch to cannabis are having a lot of success with it. And, of course, no one's in the history of the world ever OD'd on cannabis.
Okay, here's one thing I think I probably ought to acknowledge. Cannabis is occasionally adulterated, too, so be very careful with making broad claims there.
Sure.
I have a nephew who's been permanently impaired by smoking pot that was probably loaded with strychnine.
Okay, right.
That's not unknown. I do not think it represents anywhere a huge number of people, but it still does happen out there. So let's be careful about that.
It can be laced with
unregulated cannabis is a whole different beast than medical marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that said, there's an interesting published piece of data here that you can find by doing a little Google search on it. It's very easy. The National Institutes on Drug Abuse did a study using RAND as their study group to find whether there was a relationship between opioid prescribing and medical cannabis in jurisdictions where it's legal. What they found was in states where medical marijuana is sold through regulated through regulated dispensaries, the rates of opioid prescribing have come down. It's not a huge drop, but it is an observable and statistically interesting drop.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've got a lot of things being sold. There's another herbal that's called Kratom. I can't pronounce it right for diddly.
Yes.
Kratom, yeah.
Kratom is being advertised as a means for people to moderate their doses of opioids and to get pain relief. It's not regulated. It's imported from a lot of places where there's really no controls on it. But there are at least some indicators, but under the prevailing negative climate, Kratom is really not being studied. It's not being studied under grant that I know of from anywhere in NIH, and it probably ought to be, because it may have a role to play. Medical marijuana has a role to play. In California, where it's legal, I have a relative I won't name who has been taking medical marijuana in brownies, of all things,
sure,
to help with protracted pain. And there really is evidence that for a good number of people, and this is not everybody, so let's not get into the mode of going overboard here, but for a good number of people, under appropriate medical oversight, cannabis, medical marijuana, may have a role to play in either reducing the amount of pain relievers that somebody has to take of other types, or in a few cases, perhaps substituting. What we do not have is really good controlled trials data that tells us how big that effect really is. And as long as marijuana is on the Schedule 1 list, which labels it as useless, we're not going to get those studies because NIH isn't going to fund them.
Right.
I got to go move my
car. So in this case, I would say, and I mean this to be a little colorful, the Attorney General, whom you did not name, in my view, does not know enough on this subject to find his substantial derriere using both hands on a sunny day.
Well said. Well,
actually, he's a midget. Can I just say about the PTSD? I just found recently indica helps PTSD, and also small doses of opiates help PTSD. Now I got to go move my car. But this is a fascinating discussion. I'm coming back for more.
Okay. Jon Hopwood leaves us, but Jenny is pointing out in the Facebook live chat that it can cause cardiac issues, which I hadn't heard. But
sorry, what was the dose of?
Oh, cannabis. I believe that's what she's referring to. Can cause cardiac issues.
Well, I can tell you that I haven't seen that particular
kratom
point of data, so there I have to claim lack of knowledge. But there's another one that you really ought to also be aware of.
It's actually kratom. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. She clarified.
Kratom may have kratom. I have seen some reports.
Okay.
However, be very careful on how much credence you give to the reports. You really got to look at the details before you know whether the answer can be generalized. Now, there is one answer that we can generalize. When Tylenol is used at doses close to the 3,600 milligrams per day that is recommended as a maximum and used for a long period, what we see from that is quite a large number of hospital admissions from liver toxicity.
Wow.
We see 1,500 deaths by cardiac arrest every year that are associated with ibuprofen used in higher than recommended doses.
No kidding.
1,500 is not a huge number, but it's beginning to get into the range that people claim when they really understand the data for opioids. It is still a hazardous drug. In my view, at high doses, there is some reason to reconsider whether it ought to be sold over the counter or not.
That's interesting. So you're ibuprofen specifically?
Ibuprofen is associated with liver toxicity, and what's the other one I named? Motrin is the one.
That's not good news for me. I get a lot of headaches, and when I get if I get a really banger of a headache, I'll pop 4 of those. Not that I'm doing that every day.
That one, 4 of those is not a really great idea at once by any means, because you're talking probably 3,200 in one whack.
Okay.
That one you ought to be kind of careful about because it can do some nasty things to your liver.
Wow. Okay.
To liver or heart. There are cardiac issues in both Tylenol, acetaminophen, and ibuprofen. They're probably more pronounced in ibuprofen than they are in acetaminophen. So there's no side effect-free answer here, and we don't want to represent that there is. What we have got to get into here, and what we've got to start realizing, and I believe that this is beginning to happen, we've got to realize that there is no one-size-fits-all patient, and there is no one-size-fits-all therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, there is a group now meeting that I have supported as a speaker in both of the public meetings that they had that has really gotten that message. This is the Health and Human Services Department Interagency Task Force on Best Practices in Pain Management. The task force has looked at these issues with a group of medical professionals, both in and out of government, people who have practiced medicine, who have done pain medicine, who have looked at the wide variety of possible integrative, not cures, but integrative medicine type solutions and therapies. And they are basically, they've published a draft guideline, a draft set of recommendations to Congress, because that's what they were asked to do. They were asked to tell Congress, how do we to identify and remedy either gaps or inconsistencies between the published standards where, pain management is the objective. And they must have looked at least 20 different guidelines to do that from multiple sources. And the CDC guideline was one of them. But what they say is in direct contradiction to what the CDC said when they published their guidelines now over 2.5 years ago. There is no one-size-fits-all patient.
Mm-hmm.
You can't use one criteria of risk. You can't say one dose of an opioid, of a given opioid, is okay for everybody, and above that level they are at risk, because that's not the real world. That's not brain chemistry. That's not the way people actually absorb this medicine. Now, I'm going to be a little technical with you, but I'm going to try to be absolutely as simple and clear on this as I can.
Okay, appreciate it.
One of the things that was ignored completely in the CDC guidelines is a body of literature that looks at the way that opioids are broken down in the body and then move into the bloodstream and across the blood-brain barrier into the brain, because they act in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that just about all medications are broken down in the liver, at least 90% of them are. And the way they're broken down is affected by 6 enzymes. They're basically just stuff that processes things that go through the liver. Those enzymes, in turn, are expressed multiple times, and depending on the genetics of the patient, for any of a number of medications, they can be either a very poor metabolizer, in other words, they have a very hard time breaking down these substances, or they can be so efficient in breaking down the substances that the effect of them when they go into the bloodstream is over and done in minutes instead of the 6 to 8 hours intended.
Oh.
So what we're saying is that the natural ability of patients to break down and benefit from medications varies from individual to individual. There are at least 20 million people in the United States, and this is published data. There are at least 20 million people in the United States who are very rapid metabolizers of opioids. There are an even larger number that are poor metabolizers.
Okay.
And when you look at that, the implication is that what you have to do if you're a doctor and you're trying to treat somebody with these meds is you have to taper them up a little bit at a time, gradually, not all in one 3,200 milligram dose like you just described, sorry.
Right.
You have to taper them up gradually over a period of time, generally days to weeks, until you find the dose level that works. And that dose level can be anywhere from the order of 50 morphine milligram equivalents per day to 1,000 morphine milligram equivalents per day. And there are case reports, and you'll see some of them in, for instance, Practical Pain Management. It's a well-known journal. It's out there. There are case reports for individuals who can take and have taken 2,000 morphine milligrams per day without negative side effects, and without sedation, without euphoria, or at least with manageable constipation, and whose quality of life has been significantly promoted by that level with no evidence of addictive issues or tolerance.
Yeah.
So what CDC missed was a body of literature that says there's no one-size-fits-all patient.
Right.
We got to do them as individuals, and we got to look at a number of different measures in combination.
Right. Well, that makes sense.
That's an influence that is going to be seen, I believe, in the published recommendations of the task force that I just mentioned. Now, there's something else fascinating here. Can I go a little further with this?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay,
well, about the time that the CDC guidelines about the time the guidelines got published, the Department of Health and Human Services tasked their Office of the Inspector General to go back and figure out just how many people were on high-dose opioids, meaning over the criteria that the CDC eventually came up with.
Okay.
And the IG came back and said, oh, gosh, oh, gee, oh, horrible, there are millions of people that are dosed very high. This can't be right. We got to do something about that. So what the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid did was they released what's called a final call letter for rule changes that are going to take place on January 1st. And the rule changes basically authorize each individual Medicare Part D provider, and that means an insurance company, to impose 2 levels of what are called safety on opioids. And the idea here is that if somebody is taking more than 90 but less than 200 morphine milligram equivalents, when the prescription comes in and the total therapy plan that is identified in the prescription drug monitoring program exceeds 90, the pharmacist needs to call the doctor and say, was this really what you intended? Were you aware of all of these prescriptions?
Okay.
And if the doctor says, well, yes, I am aware of that, and this was my intention, then the pharmacist enters a code, and the prescription is filled and is paid for by Medicare.
Okay.
But, and this is the real big but, the same rule changes authorize these providers to do what's called a hard edit at 200 mmEDD, in which if the total amount that a patient is taking exceeds 200 mmED, and there are, oh, by the way, at least 200,000 or 300,000 people in the U.S. for which that's true now who are on Medicare, then they do a hard stop. And basically what happens is that the doctor has to contact the insurance company for authorization to fill that prescription under Medicare. Now, they claim, CMS claims, that this whole process will be done in a very timely manner and with real thought for the welfare of the patient and the opinion of the doctor as far as what the need, the medical need is.
Right.
But that claim is about as hollow as a $3 bill.
So it's easy to see where this ends up in some cases, right? A prescription gets denied, and then now you've got someone
and the patient winds up in withdrawal.
Oh, my God.
And that can happen.
Yeah.
Now, there is something I would hold out, and this is especially important, I think, for your Facebook people. The alliance that I'm assisting in leading is putting out documents now advising people that before January 1 rolls around, if you have a high level of opioid treatment, if you're being managed on opioids at a high level, you need to talk to your doctor and talk to your pharmacist and say to both of them, are you aware that the rules under Medicare will change? And probably some of the private insurance plans will change to follow them because that's the way it usually works.
Yeah.
If you're aware of the way the rules changes, would you consider doing a prior determination or a prior authorization for the continuance of my Medicare funded or privately insurance funded treatment plan? And that just basically says to the doctor and to the pharmacist, hey, look, we don't want to run into a brick wall here on January 1st.
Right, exactly.
We don't want this patient to wind up seriously in trouble because of a bureaucratic foul-up. Mm-hmm. So what's the policy going to be? And try to get some clarity on that. And if you discover that the policy is going to be, this pharmacy or this pharmacy chain isn't going to renew any prescription when the patient gets more than 200, then you need to go into the appeal process with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And there's all kinds of links out there where you can do that.
Yeah.
So what we're saying is, the left hand at the CDC, the left hand at Department of Health and Human Services either does not know or does not care what the right hand is doing. Mm-hmm. Because the left hand in the task force is saying there is no one-size-fits-all patient, and there cannot be a single safe threshold of prescription. And the right hand over at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid are saying, but we're going to allow individual insurers in individual states with no uniformity and no training to make up their own minds on whether or not they're going to restrict opioids. This is dumber than dirt.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, the alliance that I'm affiliated with has filed a formal petition with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, asking that the rule be suspended for at least a year, pending resolution of the task force recommendations.
But as of now, this is coming in January?
Far, we haven't heard peep from CMS. We don't know whether they're even bothering to read the petition or not.
This is coming in January,
but
Red?
We're quietly investigating to try to find out, is anybody listening?
No, of course not.
But this is coming in January, you said?
Right. It's a rule change that will take place as of January.
So the clock is really ticking.
It won't be uniform.
Yeah.
It'll be different from state to state and from provider to provider.
Yeah.
And the only way patients are going to find out about it is either by running into a brick wall or by asking in advance and having their doctors on board when they do.
Yeah.
You know what?
It's brutal.
The great novel of drug addiction was William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch, which is very surreal. But it basically, the whole thing boils down to this, and he even points it out. It's all about power and power relations between the junkie and the dealer, between the cop going after the junkie and the cop going after the dealer.
Yeah.
They're all in this together, you know? And it's all about power and the relation of power.
And money.
Could I respond to you a little bit on that? Because you just raised another interesting point.
Oh, go ahead, Red. Yeah.
Yeah, here's the drill. A lot of people who are claiming that addiction is the result of medical exposure may actually believe it, but we actually know that addiction is much more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. And this is something that the National Institutes on Drug Abuse has made very clear in their own publications.
Right.
And there is an alternative model, an alternative vector, if you want to say that. That's what a doctor might say. That's a vector is what produces an epidemic.
Okay.
Our epidemic, so-called, of addiction is not created by medical exposure. It's created by hopelessness.
I agree totally.
We are seeing the hollowing out of communities all through the Rust Belt. We are seeing underemployment on a vast scale because of automation. We are seeing families deeply disturbed by family breakups that are related to economics and social economic factors. So what we've got is a crisis of hopelessness and economic despair.
And exactly like after the Vietnam War, during the Nixon administration, where that was the last big blowout of opiates. I'm living in my mother's old house, and deep in a closet, I find my old Playboys. And in 1972, it's the same thing with Senator Gravel. Actually, was, if you remember him,
Gravel from Alaska.
Gravel, yeah. He was here once running for president as an old man in the New Hampshire primary. He actually had a same thing. And you know what they were blaming it on then? I'll bring it in, Matt, if I can still find it, if I didn't throw it out. They got a chart that watching Geritol commercials and that
I remember you talking about that.
Yeah, makes people exposed to more willing to go, shoot heroin.
Yeah.
Like our former mayor said, marijuana is a gateway drug, which was an ancient old canard that way back.
So here's a thought. What we're really saying is that we've got a whole lot of factors underway here that have nothing to do with medical exposure. And the war on drugs is basically a war of morality. It's a morality play as well as a power play.
Mm-hmm. And prohibition.
There are a lot of people who seem to think they have a vested interest in stigmatizing both people with addiction and people with chronic pain.
Mm-hmm.
And a kind of soundbite, if you will, that I use on this is that our federal government and our state regulators have turned the war on drugs into a war against pain patients.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly true.
Yes, absolutely.
And we asked the other day.
They're not
war
thinking.
On drugs.
So there's an interesting implication for that. To seriously put a dent in addiction, we got to find a way for people to live in stable communities. And we have to prevent addiction from happening by changing the economic conditions that contribute to it. And that means wealth has to be shared in ways very different from the way it's shared now. There's a reality underlying this that is really horrifying, but it's verifiable. The average wage of American workers has not increased in real terms since 1970.
That's true.
Yeah, that's exactly true.
Yeah.
And if I may add something, my father used to say in the early 70s, saying, it's only that it was fake. This new big drug epidemic. He says it's only because it's the middle class. There's the people took drugs, and he told us in the 1930s in the Depression, right here, like people shot heroin right out on their porches and stuff.
Yeah.
And there's
right.
and
so here's the thought, if you will, that goes with this, and this is centering on issues that surround people with addiction and people with difficulties in living. The bill that was passed under the present administration in September that puts up money for the beginnings on some answers to addiction and the treatment of addiction. It's a nice down payment, but it is not even in the ballpark on what it will actually cost to recapitalize and reinvest in our communities. The thing that is positive in this bill, and I don't want to be unfair or out of balance. The thing that is positive is that there are several pieces of the bill that try to make it more, they try to make treatment for addiction more available. They try to place more educational resources where it matters to help prevent addiction from occurring. But the thing that they don't do, to a great extent, is that they don't look at what is actually occurring because of the overconcentration of wealth in this country. Why is it that a corporate CEO makes 1,000 times more in an hour than a production line worker? And the production line worker's job is threatened because it's going to be sent overseas in order to increase profits even more.
That's true.
We're not thinking clearly about that, and we need to, because the future of our democracy and the future of our country depends on trying to find a way to rewrite the social contract and recognize that we are responsible to each other.
No, I agree.
The pain dimension of this, and the one where I focus and where I have real expertise, because I'm no politician, the pain dimension of this is that we must recognize there is no solution for addiction that destroys patient lives. Now, fortunately, we've got a few people who are beginning to wake up to this reality. 3 of them are legislators that addressed the HHS task force on September 25th and 26th, this fall. 2 representatives and a senator. And their message, all 3 of them made the message to the members of the task force: you guys know the reality on the ground of this issue, and you need to help us do this better. Mm-hmm. We need to find a balance between solving issues that are related to opioids and solving issues that are related to the appropriate treatment of pain. Mm-hmm. One has to go with the other.
Yeah.
And that is a serious change in attitude. I just hope we can see that change more generalized, and people calling their representatives and senators and governors' offices to say, "Look, I'm a pain patient,
right,
and you got to help me. You got to weigh in and add some reality to this." And let me put in another plug, if I might. And this is something that some of the folks in the Facebook group may know. The state of Oregon has an Oregon Health Commission that has put forward proposals to force every Oregon Medicaid patient who is now on opioids to taper to 0 in a year.
God.
Oh,
wow.
yeah, we have that, like, up they're saying that about the VA.
Yeah.
Can I just address something I found out at the VA?
We're going to have to wrap up soon. Just
but
keep that
about
in mind,
PTSD.
Yeah.
Pain, it's a cycle. Pain exacerbates PTSD, and the PTSD, which puts you in a negative emotional state, will exacerbate your pain. Because cognitive behavioral therapy, I actually was taught by a very skilled person, well, they put in another job because that's the way the VA is, that you can actually control pain to a degree. But we're not talking about pain, 8, 9, and 10. But when you're talking about in political science, one of the things I studied was, this was back with Howard Zinn at Boston University, but it wasn't in his class, that a society fails, and we could say a community fails, when the people can no longer anticipate the future. They can no longer trust the future. And, like, I've been laid off 3 times, and then at 50, I can't find a job. And But see, if you have a negative point of view about yourself, the pain, it exacerbates pain. Yeah. You lose the positive.
Could I kind of leverage on that by way of kind of wrapping up?
Yeah, go ahead, Red.
Yeah, you got it pretty close. One of the things that we're learning from the task force and other places is that things like CBT and like acupuncture and like, in some cases, even psychotherapy, they do have a role to play. But the really, really, really important part of this, and this is the place where legislators have completely screwed it up, is they have a role to play as additions to a program of direct pain treatment and depression management.
Yes.
Depression is the most often co-occurring medical problem that pain patients have, and it's only partly as a result of the circumstances and the social problems that go with pain. It's also a consequence that pain disturbs sleep, and pain keeps people on edge about their future and stresses them. And those factors chemically tend to build depression.
Oh, no doubt.
If you don't treat depression, you could be killing the patient.
Exactly.
However you treat depression, CBT or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely.
These things, the things that legislators have to hear is that these alternative and complementary methods are additions to a program of pain management with analgesics or anti-inflammatory drugs. They are never, ever, ever appropriate for mandated replacement.
Oh.
They can't be used that way.
Right.
And that's the message to Oregon, and that's a message which I'm very hopeful that Oregon will turn itself around on, and that other states that have also done some things almost as bad will turn around on and realize they got to get out of the business of medicine because they don't freaking know what they're doing.
Right. Well, Red, listen, you've been very, very generous with your time today, and we appreciate it. We do need to start to wrap up with you, but quickly, I mean, do you have is there a website that you want to mention that we can direct people to and so forth if they want to learn more and if they want to get in touch with you and all that?
Information, what I'll suggest is something you can do with a simple Google search.
Okay.
If you search on the Alliance for the Treatment of Intractable Pain, one of the things that will come up on top is some hits on a place where we have temporarily hosted some papers on this subject. A lot of my work is available on that subject. You can look me up just by Googling the Lawhern files. It's Lawhern.
Okay.
I really hesitate to release my email address on the air because you wouldn't believe the emails I've got now.
Okay, no, understandable.
But if you look up those two places, you can find resources. If you're on Facebook, you can look up the Alliance for the Treatment of Intractable Pain and visit the group for current information and current initiatives that our network of pain patients and doctors and professionals are putting together, and pretty much get a picture on how this whole issue is beginning to evolve and change. And we'll be more than happy to engage with you as well as we can. The one thing we have to tell you is we don't have doctor recommendations to offer because that's just too big a load for us to carry right now.
Sure.
We're focused on the policy aspect of this thing.
Okay.
So we have to ask you, if you need a doctor, start by Googling on U.S. News and World Report doctors list, because that has a listing of thousands of doctors that are organized by specialty and by state and by city. And if you need somebody in pain medicine, that's a place to go looking for them.
Okay.
In the meantime, we're going to go on working politically to help people lobby and to help people talk to their legislators and say, guys, you got it wrong. You got to fix this. And if you don't fix it, you're going home.
Yes, absolutely. All right, well, we're with you. Dr. Richard Lawhern, again, you've been very generous with your time today. Thank you so much. This was a fascinating discussion. I know everyone enjoyed it. And
thanks. I'd like to get him on my TV show sometime.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We'll have to get you guys connected. John does a television show. But, Red, thank you again, and we hope to talk to you again soon. This has been wonderful.
We'll come back, and do let me know where the link will be when you have the webcast archived.
Oh, it'll be up shortly, actually. So yes, I will let you know. I'll connect with you on Facebook, and we'll get that up. Absolutely, you got it, man.
Thank you very much, and pain patients appreciate what you are doing, and appreciate the support that comes with helping to change the public conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, Red. Thank you so much, my friend. Take care.
Good day.
Bye-bye. All right, that was great. We're going to wrap up a little early because the sports show is coming in, and I want to make sure I have time to, before this goes up at WMNHradio.org, and if you missed any part of today's show, it will be up at WMNHradio.org, but I want to chop off the beginning where we had the issue with the phone so people don't have to sit through that. But that was wonderful. Thank you to everybody in the Facebook live chat. Thank you, Jon Hopwood, for being here.
I'm kind of disappointed. I was up in the control room at the TV studio.
Yes.
Trying to get the thumb drive that I was already given on air the other day.
Yes.
And your former TV co-host, of the Community Corner, he thought I was Gary Hopper and wanted me to come in. Then he thought I was Glenn and wanted me to come in. I would think he must be having an off day on his powers.
All right, we're going to get out of here. I'm going to play some music. I'm going to play a couple of these tracks that Fred Bonig sent me that are very appropriate to the topic. Thank you, Fred. I'm going to go ahead and kill the Facebook Live room. So thanks, everybody. We'll stop that. And everybody else, thank you so much for listening. This is Steve Earle, who's fantastic, Steve Earle. This is called OxyContin Blues. And give this a listen. And if you're not familiar with Steve Earle, you should be. Thanks, Fred, for sending this.
IPMNation.com.